They dragged me out of my own house like I was a prisoner. But the truth was, they were saving me from my own son. Imagine raising a boy with every ounce of love you had, only to grow old and have that same boy turn into your captor. My neighbors had no idea what was happening inside those four walls, but the police showed up that night. They saw everything. And trust me, once they realized what I'd been living through, it shocked even them. I know what you're thinking. How could a son be that cruel to his own mother? Well, he was. And I'll never forget the day he showed me just how heartless he'd become. But what happened after the cops stormed in wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my revenge. Let me take you back and tell you exactly how it unfolded. Because no one, not even him, saw it coming. I used to think his anger was just stress, that maybe life had been too hard on him. But it became impossible to ignore when he started locking the fridge and yelling if I touched anything without asking. Imagine being 70 years old and begging your own child for food in your own kitchen. Some nights I went to bed with my stomach growling, while he sat in the living room drinking and laughing with his friends. He called me a burden, said I ruined his chances at a better life, and every insult cut deeper than the last. My house felt like a cage, and he made sure I knew I wasn't welcome in it anymore. I couldn't call anyone. He'd snatched my phone, saying I didn't need one. Neighbors waved when they saw me outside, but none of them knew I was slowly breaking inside those walls. Every night, I whispered to myself that I'd raised a monster. And deep down, I knew something had to snap soon, because I wasn't going to survive much longer, living under his control. One night, after he screamed at me for accidentally breaking one of his beer bottles, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My body was tired, but my mind refused to rest. I thought about all the years I sacrificed for him, all the meals I skipped so he could eat, all the jobs I worked to pay his tuition, and this was what I got in return. That's when a strange calm washed over me. I wasn't going to sit quietly and wait for him to destroy me. I started noticing the little cracks in his arrogance, like how he left his door unlocked when he stormed out, or how he bragged about not caring if the neighbors heard our arguments. He thought no one would ever believe me over him, but he didn't realize that sometimes the most fragile-looking people carry the sharpest memories. I began writing everything down in a notebook, every insult, every bruise, every time he took my money. I hid it inside a bag of flour he never touched. That notebook became my weapon, and little by little, I was preparing for the day I'd finally expose him. I knew I couldn't do this alone, but I also couldn't just call the police without proof. They'd see me as an old woman, exaggerating. So I played it smart. The next time he left the house to meet his drinking buddies, I called Mrs. Turner, my neighbor across the street. She'd heard his shouting before, and when I whispered into the phone, she didn't hesitate. She came over, helped me hide a small recording device in the living room, and told me she'd back me up if things ever escalated. My hands trembled as I set the recorder under the couch, but inside, something shifted. I wasn't powerless anymore. That night, when my son staggered in, he went on one of his rants, louder and crueler than usual, and for the first time, I didn't just endure it. I sat there silently, letting every hateful word burn into the tape. He didn't know it yet, but his downfall had already started, and I was the one pulling the strings. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life, but also the most important. My son's temper spiraled further out of control, and with every angry tirade, the little device captured his true self. He'd call me worthless, accuse me of ruining his life, and slam doors so hard the walls shook. One night he threw a glass against the wall, shards scattering across the floor, inches from my feet. I flinched, but inside, I reminded myself this was the proof I needed. Mrs. Turner checked in often, sometimes slipping over to make sure I was safe, and she told me she'd started keeping notes too, writing down the times she heard him screaming through the open windows. I had my own journal as well, marking down the bruises, the broken dishes, the threats whispered after midnight. It was painful to relive on paper, but each page felt like a weapon being forged, piece by piece. He thought I was just an old woman, stuck under his thumb, but really, I was building a case that would crush him. One morning, when my son stormed out for work, I finally made the call I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. My hands trembled as I dialed the non-emergency police line, but my voice was steady when I spoke. I told them everything about the screaming, the broken glass, the threats. I even mentioned the bruises he left when he shoved me against the wall during one of his outbursts. The officer on the other end didn't dismiss me like I feared. Instead, he asked for details, dates, times. That's when I slid the flash drive into my purse. The recordings, my journals, Mrs. Turner's notes, everything was ready. Later that week, 2 detectives showed up, plainclothes, pretending to be checking on neighborhood complaints. My son wasn't home, thank God, but they sat in my kitchen and listened. I could see the shift in their eyes as the audio played, his voice dripping with venom, his threats echoing through the tiny speakers. They looked at me not with pity, but with resolve. For the first time in months, I felt like someone believed me and was ready to help me end this nightmare. The detectives told me to keep living as if nothing had changed, and that was the hardest part. Every night when my son came home drunk or angry, I had to swallow my fear and act like the same helpless woman he thought I was. But secretly, I knew the clock was ticking. The police wired a small camera near the living room shelf, hidden behind a photo frame, and left me with a tiny recorder in case things escalated. They promised me they'd be watching closely. My heart pounded every time he raised his voice, wondering if the lens was catching it all. And then came the night it finally spiraled out of control. He threw a chair across the room, screaming that I was worthless, daring me to call anyone for help. What he didn't know was that every word, every violent movement, was being documented. I could feel the walls closing in on him, even as he thought he was untouchable. The hunter had no idea he'd already walked into the trap. The breaking point came faster than I imagined. That night, when he grabbed my arm so hard I felt the skin bruise instantly, I whispered to myself, "It's time." Almost as if on cue, there was a knock at the door. My son froze, glaring at me, suspicion flickering in his eyes. He stomped to the door and yanked it open only to find 2 officers standing there, badges visible, calm but firm. He tried to bluff, shouting that it was his house, his rules, but the officers had already seen enough. They stepped inside, and when one of them asked him to lower his voice, he exploded just like I knew he would. Chairs flew, curses filled the air, and that hidden camera recorded every second. Within minutes, he was in handcuffs, still thrashing and screaming, while neighbors peeked through their blinds. I stood there, shaking, not from fear but from the overwhelming relief of finally watching justice catch him red-handed. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control, I was. The days after his arrest felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare I had been trapped in far too long. The detectives thanked me for being brave enough to come forward, and the district attorney promised the evidence would hold up in court, and it did. The recordings, the bruises, the testimonies, they painted a picture of a man who thought he could bully and control his own mother without consequence. He was sentenced to anger management, probation, and barred from ever setting foot near my home again. For once, the house was quiet. No slammed doors, no shouts, no threats in the dead of night. I started cooking for myself again, walking with Mrs. Turner, and even laughed at an old sitcom rerun, something I hadn't done in months. My son thought I was powerless, but he underestimated me. With the truth on my side and the law finally listening, I didn't just survive his cruelty, ended it. And in that victory, I found a new kind of peace, one I'll never let him take away again.